federal judiciary should remove the United States military presence from Okinawa because it violates the National Environmental Protection Act. The advantage is NEPA. The plan applies it to bases in Japan as a catalyst for broader environmental protection, stops broader military environmental destruction. Shown bomb 9. Dugang as a catalyst for protection, promoting expansion extraterritorial is essential. Military bases are one of the most obvious threats to the environment. Environmental policy does not hold the DoD accountable for practices on an international basis. The military has no clear standards, like punishments at no risk of public disclosure. Irreversible environmental impacts outweigh any agency action. The approach to extraterritorial protection yields severe repercussions. The scope of NEPA is significantly larger than NHPA. International expansion would have more far-reaching effects. The risk being grossly ignored due to the lack of U.S. mandates can be applied to other policy justifications for explaining NEPA, and military environmental policy can provide more protection abroad. Dugang provides an opportunity to revisit the expansion of ESA to protect endangered animals abroad. The singular case of far-reaching effects and application of other environmental laws. There's no success story to expand protection to supplement solutions framing international claims as domestic issues or attempting to show adverse effects within the U.S. is an initial indication of the far-reaching possibilities of protection, and specifically military deference on NEPA establishes a precedent for agency discretion on matters of public interest. It dilutes broader protection by heightening the burden on plaintiffs across the board in Arctic 9. Assessment of public interest is troublesome for future environmental litigants. The war on terror's effect on discretion made it harder to find against the executive assertion of public interest. These led to a general dilution of environmental protection and judicial reforms. The accommodation mimic and mass through litigations and adverse legal position by default effect will not be limited when the shift towards a likely standard of harm. The burden of a preliminary injunction demonstrably increased exceptions are not confined to Japan. They come home to roost by muddling broader doctrine. Arnold and Porter intent discretionary covers mental jurisdictional landscape considerably. Not only courts expend resource making the determination they reach different conclusions as the executive presses to insulate more actions under discretion. NEPA is key to empower communities and stop environmental injustice. First, it increases participation in environmental decision-making, which is vital to stopping disparate impacts and empowering communities. Johnson 97. Minority communities are impacted because communities do not have important decision-making. Public participation provisions like NEPA empower communities. Provisions empower decision-making by enabling decision from solicit information vital to that process. Without such provisions, the government may reach a decision that disparately impact minority low-income communities because the government fails to obtain input. Information enables the government to identify alternatives. NEPA provides opportunities for public participation. The agency must provide notice to the public and solicit input. At a minimum, the agency must invite affected federal, state, local government agencies, any affected Indian tribe proponent, other interested persons. The agency must respond to all comments. The IS provides communities with the broad opportunities for public participation. Notification methods are much more likely to reach impacted communities. Second, it's a focal point for broader justice struggles. It brings communities together to challenge environmental injustice. Johnson 97. The community may use information and political or other form to prevent the government from going forward. NEPA provides a focal point around which communities can organize to oppose a project. NEPA can advance environmental justice by delaying government actions. NEPA is time-consuming. Citizens delay it through litigation. Representatives can sue to force compliance. Law can provide communities with valuable time to organize, provide information to the government. The delay may provide communities time to explore alternative ways to prevent the action. Environmental justice litigation is an effective tool for other challenges to structural oppression. Anti-prison activists have empirically been successful because of interaction with the current environmental justice process. The environmental justice movement pushed traditional definitions of environmental threats further beyond toxins and threats from police and imprisonment. There's growing awareness among activists of similarities between activism and environmental justice. Environmental justice fights discrimination, the selective enforcement of laws and targeting communities of color and poor communities. Any person activists far from networked with environmental justice activists is construction of new prison work with the foundation for work which would strengthen both movements. Anti-prison activists can learn from environmental justice examples. In Delano, we filed environmental lawsuit, launched a campaign with national significance for anti-prison organized litigation, provided a vehicle for building a unique and disparate coalition of civil rights, environmental anti-prison groups. The legal challenges carry the danger of organizers will lose resources and all campaigns successfully use litigation will not rely on legal action, brings a much needed attention to environmental justice, recognizing the limits of litigation. Organizers nonetheless successfully made litigation one strategy in a larger multifaceted campaign. Environmental law requires public disclosure. The opportunity for litigation provides for public education organization. The opportunity offers for residents to voice their concerns. These opportunities melded with the Delano campaign's central promise. The public knows the damage wrought by prisons. People will organize to stop its realization. Use of a combined progressive political legal strategy borrowing from an agreement with environmental justice holds promise of moving a wide range of groups from education awareness to involvement and mobilization against imprisonment. The protected battle force CDC to declare Delano at the end of the prison building era. This was the first time in 2 decades California did not have a prison in planning or construction. The movement is working to sustain this while proactively pushing for reduction in the number of Californians in cages. Anti-prison activism and scholarship has deep roots in environmental justice activism. Litigation is key. It gets movement messages out and challenges state legitimacy. Even if not a panacea, tactical engagement is valuable, but abandonment causes market. Phil and Wilson and 5. Environmental justice litigation should not give the fight. Abandoning the course is not the answer. Litigation is not a lost cause. Remedies and preventative measures are more likely to be won by lawyers assuming the roles of litigators, not as background players, taking the fight in the legal arena as counterproductive. Litigating puts the community at issue as well as other communities on notice of social issue. The needs to find local campaigns for to receive attention and legal opinions, and the press with them have reached a larger audience sympathetic to the movement. The more authoritative the court, the more press, the more communities benefit by litigating about justice issues surrounding race, poverty, the environment. Taking matters to court shows their individuals willing to represent their rights. Any legal victory will lend enormous credibility to the movement. Environmental plaintiffs select litigation as a means of obstruction. Advocates force opposition to react during a stalemate or losing PR battle. Litigation would act as a strategically utilized diversionary device while community groups attack citing decisions of the system itself from the ground up. If we let free market ideals perpetuate inequality, law and race lines and economics determine what's law, we are left with communities plagued with inequity with no recourse in battle. One's odds of success increase proportionally with the number of fronts allowing communities to have a voice. Our tactics not beyond the judiciary's purview. Grassroots organizers and lawyers should strive for complementary approaches to fighting environmental injustices. Environmental injustice perpetuates and amplifies broader structures of racial oppression. Community empowerment strategies are key because they remedy powerlessness, which is the root cause. Roberts 98. Community empowerment strategies must play a prominent role in the environmental justice strategy. They are the most effective means of addressing the root cause of injustice and economic and political powerlessness. The powerlessness to explore minority communities, the path of least resistance versus two effects. Undesirable land uses, one-sided enforcement of environmental laws is lax, resulting in toxic hotspots. NIMBY are harmful to poor minority communities for reasons beyond pollution. NIMBY perpetuates the privileges for affluent communities at the expense of poor minority communities. Community empowerment strategies are necessary because they are the only means to adequately address and remedy the underlying cause of environmental injustice. Powerlessness environment strategies seek to enable those who face the consequences of environmental decisions to be the ones making decisions. The ultimate goal is to create numerous empowered communities that will coalesce into a movement capable of exerting pressure and affecting the agenda of key decision making. Empowerment strategies are effective because their ultimate goal is to win the war against social injustice. The outcome of any particular battle is not important in terms of the final goal, social justice. Empowerment strategies adopted by environmental justice stand the better chance of success than those embraced by the civil rights movement. Black communities have in place institutions establishing civil rights because they have been experienced with collective action. Communities may be more responsive to organization efforts. Their institutions such as the Congressional Black Caucus, environmental justice advocates are better able to attract the government's attention. Specifically, extraterritorial NEPA stops global waste dumping. Helfenstein 89. Producer disposers escape constraints by shipping waste to other countries. Regulation of disposal requires extraterritorial application of U.S. law. The NEPA required agencies to consider environmental impacts depends to tie NEPA extraterritorially. Networks result executive order requires a complete EIS if the action involves hazardous radioactive waste or affects the environment beyond the borders of the nations participating. Also, NEPA only applies to government and federal agencies supervise development of projects in areas of the world where environmental regulations are less likely to be enforced. The impact is mass global death. Olson 95. Reports of increased cancers in nuclear facilities under her conclusion to harmful study radiation cost genetic impairments, damages, time bomb loading. The environmental radioactivity from multiple sites is not reversible. Exposure translates to a fatal cancer risk of 1 in 286. Underestimation becomes a bonus. Radiation effects signing death warrant. Pragmatic engagement is complementary with radical resistance. It is necessary for interim goals, momentum building, and repurposing powerful institutions. 4.3. Transnational links are invaluable creating an understanding of global hegemony. However, differentially manifested movements are building bridges of awareness around the globe in the sphere of growing collective consciousness. Movements need to adopt a symbiotic strategy of pragmatic engagement as well as resistance against waste rain. The Basel Convention alliances are formed between NGOs and delegates to push for a ban on waste. A ban is an important incremental step towards social change, engaging the process as well as retaining outside grassroots critique is an important element to reflect the movement. Agency co-option is not clear-cut. While radicals extend critique, immutable insiders play the game of influence. When used to define the system, the main channel support to resistant global carry out their ideas near to the heart of power. Collective global consciousness would bring insiders and outsiders together in symbiotic strategy. Radical movements are recognizing the need for engagers to retain links with the grassroots in the battle over global civil society and attempts to radicalize and expand. Master's movements think globally while resisting locally, remain in dialogue with international and institutionalized organizations, keeping them alert and keeping the radical message of ecology and social justice alive by challenging limits of sociology, social reality and practice. Highlighting toxic waste is a broader challenge to oppressive structures. There is not a forced choice between reform and revolution. 4.3. Groups campaigning against toxic waste do not retain a narrow campaign focused on consciousness about toxic organization of society, deepening understanding the related issues on a more systemic basis. The ideological shift to not in anybody's backyard presents a concrete recognition waste should not be produced, directly challenging production, consumption is a wider realization of environmental justice movement that engages broader questions of gender, class, racial inequality. The capitalist economy waste breaks through enclosures, politicizing issues previously considered private movements that profess emancipatory aims are bound to misrecognize relationships with hegemony unless analysis is articulated through globalization. Radical agency cannot solely be equipped with the revolutionary juxtaposed reformist agencies. Such a fragmentation is disempowering in the face of dominant hegemonic agency. There is a spectrum. The movements with emancipatory potential, the global aspect of movements forming a decentralized environmental justice movement lies in their challenge to global hegemonic structures of production and consumption. It is possible to think globally and act locally. Movements have to adopt a holistic approach targeting interconnectedness of environmental and social problems within the global economy. Only a linking of global and local can solve the horrific violence of waste dumping, but policy-oriented scholarship is key. Lloyd Nate. Cayenne a ship with 14,000 tons of incinerated ash from Philadelphia dumped the 3,000 tons of ash on a beach near Haiti. The sea spent 2 years trying to unload its cargo on 5 different continents. They have this information regarding Cayenne exposure to waste and work of advocacy groups throughout the creation of waste management regime. Epistemic communities provide the link between localized issues, the global implications, policy solutions, the intensification of worldwide relations with linkages to locales, even localized policy increasingly involve global concern, transnational communities and merge to deal with this. These facilitate diffusion of knowledge from the local to the global level, which influences policy-making, policy change, and international renews primarily a bottom-up process. Issues such as transfer of hazardous waste formerly overlooked or shifted from local to global arena. With the help of epistemic communities, control over knowledge and information is an important dimension of power that can lead to new patterns of behavior.
Okay, I guess, what's a public?
What's a public?
Yeah.
So, in the context of our evidence, it just means that people who live in the area where NEPA applies.
Okay, so people who live in the area where NEPA applies,
Yeah.
NEPA happens, and I guess who voices the concerns that sort of like environmental problems / waste dumping is happening?
So right now, our argument is that people are voicing concerns, but the executive isn't required to listen to them because there's a public interest exception. So if you'd like some examples.
So if the public all agrees upon something in this world, wait, so the public there all does agree on something that waste dumping should not be happening, right? That's
well,
at least what
like
your evidence says.
All one public, or there are like different constituencies.
There's like
and groups.
a big majority that agrees X.
So that's not really how NEPA operates. So the way it works on the ground is that NEPA requires the government to, or any large-scale buildup, to proactively reach out to communities that they affect and solicit input.
What effects?
I'm sorry?
That they affect who, like, what affects?
That those buildups affect.
That what buildups affect?
So an example given by some of our evidence is prison building. Another example is building a massive hog
So the United
farm.
States, or like in certain areas, let's talk about our government. The United States would proactively go to a place in which they think people are going to go to prison and do what?
No, so whenever a prison is being built, the government is required to ask the people around whether or not they can build that prison. Actually, not in the status quo, because there's a public interest exception that allows the president, or rather the executive branch, to build things without impunity. But the plan changes that and requires the government to affirmatively solicit input about the buildings it builds.
And it's
Okay,
not
so,
just
like, the
asked,
public gets
but it's
to decide
legally
what?
mandated.
Right.
Or, sorry, do you want me to answer that?
No.
Okay,
I guess I'm
sure.
curious, what empirical examples do you have that, like, when a community of color did speak up regarding, like, prison abolition, it stopped, like, prisons from being built? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's the Bras Card, which talks about the Delano Prison campaign, which stopped the building of the Delano Prison in California, and was the first time in decades there were no prisons in planning or construction in California.
Right, I guess, what does it mean to be in a prison?
What does it mean to be in a prison?
Yeah.
I don't really have an answer in a metaphysical sense, but the Delano Prison is an example of a place.
You don't have an example in it. What do you mean? Like,
So-
what does it mean to be sort of captive?
What does it mean?
What does
to
it
be
mean to be
captive?
held captive and marked criminal?
So our evidence says that it's an extreme form of powerlessness, which is something that NEPA
An extreme form of powerlessness. I
Yeah.
guess. What does it mean to have power?
To have, I guess that's a good question. Michael, what do you think?
Well, I think there are many types of power, and I don't think they have.
No, I'm
necessarily
talking
have
about
to
the
take
one
a
that's
stance
bad
on
about
that.
prisons. So let's take it
It's
back
bad
to your
for
example.
people who are disproportionately black and people of color to be targeted and subject to the horrific conditions of prisons. We don't
Yeah, I
necessarily
asked you
need
what
to
is
have-
a prison. You said a prison is a place that is bad. One example was one that was built and it made people feel powerless.
It'll be one off. Mimi, do you mind handing me the podium?
No, you have another setup one right there.
Oh, never mind.
I have no beef with you using my podium. I just thought that one was
No,
already
this one is already set up to my height.
shorter,
so.
right? That was my thought process.
Wow. Okay. Well.
I think we're good whenever.
Alright, anyone now, ready? Cool. Public deliberation structurally cannot include the position of the slave because they're denied personhood by definition. The structural violence of slavery cannot be articulated within the political heartland. In 9, concerned about the possibility of practically related to the particular options and situations subject formation of the slave to decide the political property, leaving both question the appropriateness of the political to this realm of practice and the reimagined the political in this context. The historical and social limits of the political must be recognized in order to evaluate the articulation of needs and the porting of place in the main related and the privatized and non-political the agency of the enslaved is merely relegated to non-political side of this divided the subjects removed from the public sphere are formally outside the space of politics everyday practice and the slaves generally fall outside direct forms of confrontation. The slave is neither superman nor pre-worker but excluded from the narrative of with the people reformulation the relation of state and civil society the context of the historical bloc and its expanded definition of political maintains the notion of political inseparable from the effort and ability of class to affect hegemony and the notion of futurity relies on a flawed optimistic investment that the future will eliminate anti-blackness. This displaces and erases the recurring structural features of anti-blackness. Time does not pass for black flesh and merely accumulates continually reproducing the dereliction of blackness as a fuel that powers the horrifying violence of civil society. Dylan in 13. Anti-blacks inaugurators of chattel slavery, the death sentence time not only accumulates, it captures theorization time as accumulation, capture profound implication for how we understand the future. Traditionally, the future is the space of all possibility and hope. When we imagine the future is the outcome of the message behind the past. Also, when the present disappears, the future becomes relief from the devastating weight of everything that has come before. The time does not pass when it accumulates. The future is not a triumph of the tendency to the present. The future is the place for the record of then and now lives on the past, which racial terror less about the present, but also a vision of what is to come and what the future will be. And our alternative is to reject the affirmative in order to focus on an unflinching paradigmatic analysis that calls for the end of American Wooderson in 10. In South Africa, began to see one essential non-flinching pragmatic analysis is to movement dedicated completely for authorities considering where the new level compromises that the radical elements of the charged movement made with the moderate elements were due to our inability and unwillingness to hold the moderate speed to the power political agenda predicated on unflinching paradigmatic analysis. We allowed our energies and wants to potentially be displaced on pragmatic consideration. We abdicated the power to political question. Power to political question is greatest power of all. This procurement in many political academic discussions is based with the word revolution is focused in earnest for your qualifiers and irony. In the black matrix of black woman is located at the structural position of rape. This conception does not formulate rape as an incident which happens or one is more or less vulnerable to, but rather the very condition for being of the black woman and by extension both slaves in the world which those slaves built. James in 13. Flights in captivity and communal conceptual wilderness created the room of philosophers habit at the boundary of democracy. After realism recognized the two coterminous phenomena democracy as a boundary redefining freedom from captivity and moral philosophy. The borders reimagining freedom from flight reproductivity points to the black matrix as the set for symbolic and material subjugation. The birth of maroon racial capital overshadowed racial group seeming racial gender difference masculinized black suffering of following of black female trauma into black male frame. Death for massive person stopping first norm centered on violence in the public racial frame is complicated and recurrent, although all materials are traceable to the black matrix. The focus on the nation subjugated and sense of brief and interior colonization, glorification, black wombs, and matrices that have no public record to deny black matrix offers the deniability of systemic violence where terrorists meet. The Western democracy manufactures black matrices boastful through linguistic and material economy. Civilians are the primary targets of terror against black people matrices and children. The DNA, police, military, master sisters, races, are working immigrants of black captives and maroons all can be found in the bodies of the black matrix. Politicized black mothers transform tragedies into a breach of democracy, and their philosophy participates in a renewable economy, forgetting by which being is rock gas, stardust, and butterflies, and erases the foundational laws of Africanity and ecological relation for the black refusal to stop grieving the foundational loss of black ecology. James in 11. The earth that is decided black memory represents a belief in organic proximity, reciprocity lines separating humans from nature, living with the dead, seriously determined while African Americans become modified to primacy and new world slavery without the body of violence suffering the captive body. The motive will is activist at first person taking under being uprooted from the homeland of watchword strange land, and speaking of black diversity nation from a homeland that have difficulties of prospering on new soil and forced to disconnect from the land of autonomous capacity or neither continued injustice nor continued mobilization be understood apart from slavery. Eco melancholy in the dawn as the inability or unwillingness to stop mourning. Eco melancholy disavows mourning for renewable economy. The intended theory that scarcity medicates loss. There will be no fresh objects to replace the natural order. Environmental theories of consumption are view that the earth is replenishing. Eco-melancholy is a historical memorial disposition defense against mourning solid prematurely forget response to cumulative losses in nature, land, resources, and traumas under those losses, death, and disposition activated by the ongoing and interrelated social and political violence, including war, genocide, and poverty. Eco-melancholy refuses to take consolidation, fantasy, verification, while destruction occurs unabated or continues cooperation of the state and institution were no less than co-conspirators and widespread slaughter. If white waves could include the killing of their own white children in the earth, and African Americans were especially enslaved cursed with long memory who inability to suppress black elliptic trauma differentiates her from whites of faith and African American immunal exceptionalism has been shaken some of us know. We have never felt safe in violence experienced by others is contingent upon non-participation in dominant social practices. Anti-black violence cannot be evidenced through historical events because blackness as a structural position is constituted outside humanity, creating an objective non-contingent relation to violence. Wilderson in 11. Bailey launched 66 operation against the large police state. Vertigo must succeed then every time they clash with the agents of nuclear weapons regime subject to vertigo. Dizzying sense of one is moving brought on by clash of virtually asymmetrical forces. Subjective vertigo is vertigo the event of the sensation that one is not simply spinning in an otherwise stable environment where one's environment perpetually unhinged from the relation to violence that cannot be analogized. Object vertigo life constituted by disorientation, structuralist virtue, performative violence. Black subjectivity is the intersection of performative and structural violence. Black is sentient though not a human. Black to be evil subjection by violence and paradigmatic necessity. Human evolutionary suffer subjective vertigo before the slave. There are no cognitive mass of suffering and dispossession, and their focus on international conflicts only ignores the living apocalypse of refusal, color, and domestic warfare of white supremacy. Rodriguez in 10. If we are to approach racism in global ways, nothing short of unconscionable spend significant political energy protesting American lawyers elsewhere when they're overlapping the no less profoundly oppressive declarations, mobilizations, or in a very own most sentiment in your hierarchies and mothers unspoken politics, assumption takes forgetting the misdivided permanence of domestic warfare, contra protection to target the massive suffering out of the logic of black, brown, indigenous, subjecting the expediencies of central violence in the American nation, building part of the left and not care to imagine the abolition of use domestic warfare and instructional white supremacy, sociological left seems to get into engage in desperate attempts to manage the causality of domestic warfare, how it could live as itself in domestic state of emergency. Why do we seem to generally forfeit the greater possibilities but radically challenge its logic and transforming the ideological and institutional premises of the condition for domestic warfare for short-term monetary policy reforms and development and crashing pedagogies compel us to teach ourselves about the different ways that the state works in conscious domestic warfare. The left remains relatively unwilling to address the questions of social survival, grasping mobilization, radical social justice, and social determination in the concrete and everyday terms of the very domestic war. This storytelling through it, repetition and saturation, symbols of popular common sense, domestic warfare is inseparable with the on-ground shifting, recommitting resources, institutional power, the witness, and the everyday mobilization, state waging intense localized military struggle against the declared internal enemies, the regularity with which progressive work organization immediately forfeit the crucial political and conceptual possibilities of abolishing domestic war as a regular reflection of the event to which domestic war has been fashioned into the everyday, and their coalitional approach to racial relations that focuses on the shared experience of colonization, racism, and scarce the singularity of anti-blackness by focusing on the white non-white divide, while non-black people of color may represent an authorized population of blacks or strangers to the world with no place within, outside, or outside the U.S. Number 13, calling for non-blacks to resist the will of whiteness, realize the mythical shared movement, the emergence of bureaucratic multiculturalism. We are to assume that there's a solidarity from non-blacks towards African Americans and every anti-black aggression, Afro-pessimism seeks to demonstrate the singularity of racial slavery as the basis of a globalized racial antagonism between blacks and non-blacks, and demand for universal coalition, disciplinary adjuster against black radicalism, which have been a different Asian American ethnic groups so as to condemn African Americans, ostracized some Asian Americans were nevertheless regarded by some as more similar than African Americans' refusal to admit to significant differences in structural position, born in decrepit histories between blacks and political allies. The singularity of racial slavery is interference specific to African descendants. A colonial analogy is a version of the white non-white model. Race has been called into question by Afro-pessimists. The U.S. racial hierarchies are structured by black non-black divide, minimize the singularity of racial slavery by subsuming it under a general oppressed status of scarce black suffering engaged in people of color blindness inherent to the concept of people of color that misunderstands the specificity of anti-blackness and trying to demonstrate how domestic racism, imperialism, and intertwined ultimately misses what is essential about the situation. Black existence not represent the total reality of the racial formation, but it does relate to the totality, whole range of positions within the racial formation, most fully understood from this vantage point. And the affirmative anchor within civil society assumes the grim struggle for hegemony in which citizens cannot occupy position within a democratic polity and change the state from the inside out. Where to sin in 3. The dream students return to insights regarding revolution in society, which state capital formation protected by the trends of civil society that by initiative activities, and hegemony must be reconfigured before revolution can take form. A frontal solve is not the rate of the working class and pedagogic project of parents over common sense and good sense instruction, the formula which virtual powers exercise and victory on the front of impossible conclusive frontal attack war movement for revolution to be feasible. The proletariat must be held to a revolutionary position for that to happen. The trend civil society must be transformed to our position, a process by which workers force working in civil class civil society is eliminating traditional and intellectual personnel fashion the discourse of all society civil societies firms of which they become hegemonic and structural flaws in need for procedures and ensure that efforts of environmental justice and inclusion is a facade outcome 6. Even as assumed that agencies will fully integrate into NEPA's usefulness and limited by structural gaps, having in structural public participation in NEPA raised doubts about whether environmental justice concerns will be brought to bear on agencies of decision-making. Public participation is only required by NEPA after the EI is completed. The notice and comment for for an EIS there has been limited public involvement before and during EE preparation by EPA and Randall. Proposed site of a city-sponsored hotel and parking garage construction project claimed that the public hearings were a charade. And 3 seconds.
Okay, you good?
Yeah.
Is anti-blackness learned or innate?
Anti-blackness is an ontological condition of civil society.
Okay, so does that mean that it is learned or is it innate?
I'm not sure what you mean. It's not necessarily like ontological, i.e. like a baby born in a vacuum would be anti-black, but that civil society, because of how it's structured, means that everybody within civil society is anti-black.
What's that structuring that means that?
Sorry, what that was...
What's the structure of civil society that guarantees that anybody within it is anti-black?
Civil society is anti-black, therefore people who are permeated by civil society because they exist within it, engage with encountering
How do you
blackness.
know?
Can I really quickly answer your question?
Sure.
I think that our argument is that there's a political ontology. Obviously, we're not Hegel. We don't think that anti-blackness is innate / there's a desire that would just happen by proxy for white people to decide to consume blackness. But we do think that there is a political ontology that shapes not only our understanding / relationship to the world, but your understanding / relationship to the world. Blackness defines identity and the identity-making process, how white people understand themselves, and how white people understand themselves in relationship to black people. Black people don't understand themselves, which is why,
Okay, so how did this political ontology come about?
Well, I guess in the context of Wilderson, we'd say that that transatlantic slavery was the creation of modernity, that it was the founding event, that engagement with scientific racism during the Enlightenment era allowed Europeans to say, this is what blackness means, this is what it means to be black, therefore, because this is blackness, this is what whiteness means, this is what redness,
How did
yellowness,
that become an ontology?
Because of, well, I guess there are like various events that define this, but the ways in which colonial powers operate, they spread anti-blackness throughout the world. The U.S. developed systems of slavery, so did people within the Caribbean, within Europe, et cetera, et cetera.
But
so they're like
Africans went into the
processes.
slave trade as Africans and came in as black. The literal forcing people into slavery / reducing bodies to property / dereliction was the identity-making process for white Americans,
Sure.
and that is what continues to sustain and define America.
Got it. I have another question. So the Hartman Card public deliberation structurally cannot include the position of the slave. We have evidence in our 1AC about black people using NEPA, etc. Is your argument that that is not meaningful?
Well, the argument is not obviously that black people can't physically be within politics, like we know that Obama exists, but rather it's not that black people can't be located within politics, but that black demands are not deemed political, they're deemed apolitical, they're relegated to the privatized, non-political side of the divide.
So is your
the
argument
language
that
Hartman
demands
uses.
to close prisons were not political? Because that was recognized as per our evidence.
I don't.
Yeah,
since
that's
when?
why we think your app is misleading. We think that it tells black people to force their political potential, hope, revolutionary psychic
Okay.
energy, and praxis into doing things like
Sure.
prison abolition, which I guarantee y'all one is probably not a good thing.
Great. So,
And also hasn't been
what do we
successful.
do after we call for an end to America?
Well, the envisioning of the end of America we think is a useful project in being able to negate putting our agency into things like institutions that we isolate are anti-black as per Hartman, Dillon, etc.
Great. We'll
All right. Yeah, we'll take a second. Okay. The order will be the case, the K. Hey, is the other timer behind my computer?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, everyone ready? Nuclear waste is an independent impact that you can hang your hat on. Waste causes millions of painful deaths from cancer and poisoning, which disproportionately are marginalized communities. It is irrelevant if they win a root cause because waste is already in the ground. It is only a question of cleaning up. You should prefer this impact is more easily identifiable and solvable than the majority of their arguments. Now, independently, the app is a giant link turned to the criticism. Communities of color bombarded with nuclear dumping, oil spills, toxic landfills, sewage facilities, and manifestations of disparate environmental impact. This fortifies the structure of racial privilege by systematically and silently decreasing life expectancy and quality of life prospects for people of color. The air pollution, toxic smog, and high cancer rates are material and symbolic demonstrations of racial inequity, which must be challenged. NEPA is the only respite, but exceptions a broad set of precedent and model application at home. Here is a framing issue. We do not have to win that the app results in transformation of all societal relations, just that it is sufficient to create material to improvements that make people's lives massively better. Now, okay. I will answer their NEPA link at the top. NEPA is a challenge to injustice. ASA point is nexus for organizing. Even if review does not directly change policy, it is a vehicle for communities of color to coalesce because they can take advantage of things like media attention, getting the word out, and the government being forced to listen. That is our Johnson evidence. We have empirical proof for our argument that California abolishes UCIS requirements to freeze construction for prisons for the first time in 2 years in California. That is the broad evidence. Community empowerment is a crucial explanation to racial justice because it remedies the economic and political powerlessness that is at the root of injustice. Visa point is obstruction. You can win all of your claims that NEPA reviews were ultimately ignored, and we still have a solvency argument because NEPA throws sand in the gears of the legal machinery. It forces the government to waste a bunch of time and money fighting off frivolous reviews that buy time for other more revolutionary projects and make them net more effective by sapping government resources. That is our Johnson and Wills evidence. All their evidence is hypothetical about minor flaws. It does not say that that is fixed or total. Empirics should frame this debate. Multiple successes of NEPA Bullard in 2K. Environmental justice groups are making their voices heard loud and clear. Groups are winning in courts, making a difference in lives of people from West Portland, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, research groups one important victory, safety, South Carolina, landfill, Roads Federation, South Dakota, Citizens Against Toxic Exposure, convince EPA to relocate Florida families from toxic waste upstate, and 4 and 1 relocation. This marked the first time a black community wants to relocate on the government Superfund from West Harlem environmental action. 1.1 million settlements get to for massive sewer treatment plant. Citizens nuclear tracks defeated plants while Louisiana build the nation's first privately owned uranium and original plant. Mark the card there. We solve because your evidence says that its usefulness is limited by express and judicially recognized exceptions to NEPA requirements. But the plan closes that exception. You have independently conceded the show evidence that the plan is a catalyst for broader application of NEPA, which resolves current problems by reinvigorating the doctrine. Now, framework debate should prioritize evaluation of policy consequences. The point of the win for policy scholarship to have a tangible effect. Skills gained through policy discussion serve as a training ground to produce effective scholar actions along Napoleon 10. Research is increasingly important tool for those at the community, state, federal, and international levels to overcome a specific democratic policy. Here, research can strengthen and inform policy analysis and has rendered it to offer contributing solutions to social policy problems to participate on equal footing of policy advocacy. Public advocacy work needs to be increasingly research and suggested in organization and scholar activists advocates and we can be improved by a stronger public engagement. As a consequence of greater scholar activists advocate integration and greater visibility, policy windows open. This provides a tremendous opportunity by innovative research, defensible answers, and proposals that can affect evolution of policy. There is no better, more important time for research to be put into action. Debate is an ideal venue for this because it forces debaters to grapple with policy concerns of cost, jurisdiction, implementation, etc., which creates activists who can speak to policymakers, legal education on NEPA, empowers marginalized communities to challenge the state. Tolmay 3, growing up on the Rosebud CO reservation in Mid-Tennessee, EOTA had little interest in the legal system or environmental laws, but that changed when a corporate hog producer announced plans to build one of the largest pig farms of the reservation. Now, following successful 5-year court battle, women are teaching other tribes to use the nation's bedrock environmental laws NEPA to protect Native American lands. Facility use 1.6 million gallons of water per day. A scarce commodity on the reservation. Residents would have to endure the smell under the reservation is with toxic pollutants after the BIA approved the project. The women formed to the roof. Well, the concerned Rosebud area citizens, they also studied NEPA. If you're going to stand up and be a voice for the people, you better understand the law. You better know what you are talking about. The two women used to challenge the hog farm at the core of the story. Rosebud illustrates how corporations target poor rural communities now. Anti-blackness is a political untold project, not a fiat accompli. All human systems are necessarily changeable, and they take too narrow a view of history and marginalized resistance, which has averts change Gordon 15. One problem we look at humans' interpretation of closed systems is we often try to get rid of the model of how we work. It's a generalization we commit a serious problem when we do political work. Olderson, for instance, there was discussion people built it on, or out of my earlier books, you notice an indefinite article, the anti-black world, the world is different from the anti-black world, the project racism is trade a world that we completely anti-black, although that is a project, is not a fiat accompli. People don't understand how recent this phenomenon is. A lot of people talk about race, they don't know the history of how race is constituted to theonaturalism, for instance, Andalusia, the pushing out of the wars and history of how race and Christianity was formed. People don't understand from the standpoint of species 220,000 years old, what the hell is 500 years? We created a false model for how we study those last 500 years. We study these 500 years as if people have been dominated who have not been resisting. The problem is formulation of pessimism and optimism. They are both based on a prior knowledge. Most human beings don't have prior knowledge. Whatever we need to guarantees for our stack, understand that in all political action, it's not about you. It is about what you are doing for a world you may not even be able to understand. People who have done it before, or people who fought anti-colonial struggles. That is why we're developing political insights come in. We forget the systems. We're talking about our human systems. They are not the systems of the way we talk about laws. Physics, human system can only exist by human action, maintaining them, which means that every human system is incomplete. Every human is by definition incomplete. You can go this way or another way. The system is actually closed. Many people, if up on concrete levels in which people build alternative ways of imagining global future, for non-breaking insights, you need to understand that directly and probably so in issue or new kind of relation you kill with the slave reversal. So that is not the actual history. Every single instance there was slave revolt. Point is that you have one history where it says he freed the slaves, and the actual history where slaves freed themselves, who freed the women's movement, the opposed to women who cared about liberation. We were unable to look at the world differently because women fought. It's not that they said treat me better. They got up and went out in the streets. Every instance of anyone doing activism really works. The error people make is they think just because in the past they were overcome rebellions, they don't realize rebellions change conditions. Mark the card and conditions there. James Evidence uses psychoanalysis, which is non-falsifiable word in one, and merely psychoanalysis postmodern into you great scholarship that otherwise action ends in discourse in which metaphors pose for reality. The problem with the psychoanalysis is there can be no testing pioneers to write ideas in the context of work from individual patients outside of consulting rooms. There can be no verification process, and the further one moves from the individual, the less perched ideas can have everything be true. If everything is true, then nothing can be false, and therefore nothing can be true. And the NEPA challenges each tenet of social death. It allows for community empowerment and stopping prison construction, which are all inroads to challenging general dishonorment, gratuitous violence, and alienation, and they're not like there is no trade-off between understanding how environmental injustice harms black and non-black people of color too. We are not the type of parasitic politics that this evidence indicts. Fraud groups do not need to work together or erase differences, but NEPA is a tool in the toolbox for many different groups to use independently. 3, their link is purely theoretical. The material benefits of our scholarship and NEPA reviews vastly outweigh any impact. Now change is possible, which answers their time like reformism is effective and brings revolutionary change closer to Gallo 9. Critical scholars recognize peaceful forming criminal change. They argue merely postpones wholesale reformation of our system by have used in case of reform to legitimize oppression. The critique of reform is imperialistic, while the critique of self-minorities, they should interpret events affecting the court order, directing authority to disperse funds for keeping housing, make post on the revolution, or it may not in the meantime. The order keeps taking place forward. It smacks of maternal soon to serve the possibility of revolution. Later, always keep now with criminal change to bring revolution change in the third, but also all reforms into some place needs sublet the appetite for further combat critique of reform is the possibilities and less the question of whether total change when it comes will be what we want. Second, the F is negative state action. A subpoint is it withdraws a military base from Okinawa that is a cause of massive suffering and violence against people. B subpoint is NEPA. The F does not net increase reviews. Communities of color and black people are already vested in legitimacy of the law and are trying in NEPA cases. It's only a question of whether they will be effective. Third is even if it's not transformed against material benefits, which are important higher. And three, though the ultimate goal is total negation of state, this long-term objective must not prevent us from engaging immediate struggles to secure survival of those currently in prison. We must not allow us to face a vision to obscure immediate struggles of those locked down by the system. Mark the card. That system now filter the link debate through alternative solvency. They have no explanation of what a paradigmatic analysis does to change broader structures. Absent that, the alternative is useless. White and 6 individual relations to slide over to respect changes and individuals. The point of contact position right to social field is to find situation for all kinds of habit is implicate more by experience, by association, social capital performances are produced by routine without reference to a body qualified non society. This event of individual understanding the moment in time, even the behavior is institutionalized. There must be relation the government, their explanation can reduce the consciousness of individuals. Now permutation to do the vote, permutation do both, permutation do the app as a parallel front to a paradigmatic analysis. Adopting different tactics avoids co-option. There are three net benefits. One is only the perm opens multiple paths of struggle. Revolutionary critique can exist independent of, but alongside the app. Fighting the state on multiple fronts overstretches it and makes resistance easier. That's Wilson. 2, reverse co-option. A person on the inside radicalizes institutions and gets info out to people on the outside, which makes the resistance front net more effective. That is the forward evidence. Third, contingent legal change is necessary and doesn't trade off with revolutionary practices. Newton and 80. Panthers, despite reputation, Democrat rules, and did not issue Democrat reform. The party utilized legal machinery to bring social change and encourages black enterprises. The party frequently filed civil lawsuits seeking relief from injustice. Panthers turned to the ballot running for mayor and city council. Party involvement was admittedly credited by 2 successful candidates for elections. A combination of parties using use of legal means of reform was important to build in community institutional amnesty use reform was criticized in consistent with the revolution. This is illogical. The ultimately determining element in history is the production of reputation in real life. As somebody who twists he transformed reputation into meaningless abstract stimulus phrase. Panthers combined a unique blend of elements that set them apart of traditional civil rights and revolutionary ideology. That card is stopped at a revolutionary ideology.
Sorry, do you know where that is?
I think that was the second to last card in the deck. Newton 80, if you control off that.
Right, no, I meant like in the context of like the card where those words were.
Oh, somewhere near the end. It was right near the end. Panthers combine a unique blend of elements that set them apart from traditional civil rights.
Yeah. Okay, found it.
Yeah.
Alright, cool.
I got through most of it. That's better than most times.
Yeah, I'm proud of you, Michael. Okay.
Thank you. All right, ready?
Yeah.
Sure.
Alright, so your overview on the app says when you're describing the impacts from waste dumping that millions of people are affected, that waste is already in the ground, then it's a question of cleaning it up. I'm wondering, how does the app clean up waste that has already been dumped?
Yes, the app cleans it up, because a part of NEPA reviews could be demanding that corporations who have already put waste into the ground have to engage in some form of reparation, some form of redress.
The requirement then for, like, how often will that happen? You said it could
Well, that's actually the beauty of NEPA reviews, which is that there is no one singular requirement. Rather, that is determined by...
How is that a beauty that waste isn't demanded to be cleaned up?
Well, it is demanded
to be
cleaned up.
So, like, some communities will still have waste with them,
No, because waste will get demanded to be cleaned up. However, we don't demand a singular remedy. That's up to communities who are affected by that waste. The beauty of NEPA review is it allows communities to be in the driver's seat. They can collect information, they can make reports, they can file court briefings, and those are all legally actionable.
Okay, one EC cross-ex, you indicated that NEPA has to do with the building of projects. What about things that have already been built? I guess that, never mind.
That's also an issue of environmental harm that it would address, and we also stop future waste from being dumped.
Wait. Things that have already been destroyed, but still the waste is still left there. Does NEPA apply to that as well?
Yes.
Okay, cool. You say later that NEPA is good because it causes media attention, forces the government to listen, and that has created some forms of changes. So BLM Ferguson, Baltimore, when black people protested against the government, they were met with violence. So I'm wondering, how do black people know when their protests against the government will be effective and when they will be met with violence?
Well, I think you start off by mischaracterizing our argument a little bit, because the media attention warrant isn't to get the government to listen, but rather to galvanize communities and get that word.
You specifically said force the government to listen. I'm not mischaracterizing, that was a verbatim quote. But that's not the really important part of my question. The point of my question was that you say that there have been changes that have been made that have been affected because of black demands on the government. I'm giving this other example of black demands on the government being met by violence, no changes being made. So how do black people make a choice between whether they should invest their energy and decide no matter what, like even if violence will be met, that there's a possibility for change? Like how do they weigh those options?
That's not really the point of what we're saying, and black people make determinations to engage in NEPA or not engage in NEPA
Okay,
now. The
so
plan just makes
I
NEPA
guess,
effective.
Continuing on with that, if NEPA is the only, or if there are like small advancements that black people have made, why should they continue to invest their energy within a system that engages in violence towards them?
Well, I don't think NEPA is engaging with that system. It's throwing sand in the gears of legal machinery. It's sabotaging prison construction, etc.
We're not saying anyone should invest their energy anywhere. Like that's not, the app is not like black people should use NEPA. It is black people should have as many tools available. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, it'll be the critique.
There's like a lengthy overview I personally would pull up. Oh, I didn't mean to throw that away. Anyway, an entire column. Sorry, that was actually really depressing. I sandwich away for no reason.
Are there cards you're sending?
No.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Give me a second.
Okay.
But yeah, on the critique, and then it will just be down. And the permutation will be in the 1 hour wherever you had that flagged. Okay.
I'm not
Everybody good?
quite ready, sorry. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. Eco-melancholy is the best framing to talk about black violence. We need to come to a realization, current situation, we are in a pooping a cynical, and instead of optimistic, optimism makes extinction of life as we know it far away. That's absurd, something that can pass as a minor thing, like NEPA to solve, instead of seeing the R effect on, and terms on it, in terms of being in the world and the situation we're in. Failure to forefront the black matrix independent reason vote negative shows that the app's approach resolve the environment without realizing the world is built of accumulation. Exchange of black women is anti-black accumulation structures the world. 1AC is treating a diagnostic holistically wrong prescription. The 1AC is process. The 1AC is a process for wanting to start create new clean world, not accessible, safe, because there are no fresh objects to replace natural world. Instead, we should engage in a process eco-melancholy, which is pessimistic mourning of the earth that starts from the position of blackness, using future catastrophe to is blackmail to justify continual existence in the state notion that we can do something like the alternative, but XYZ must come first, makes black people suffer to continue to sacrifice their social life for an institution that not only created the problems in the like waste dumping in the environment, but guarantees their social death. The Dillon's evidence doesn't impact into the idea of a new clean future, says it doesn't come to terms with reality. No pass for black people, but rather that time does not pass for black people, rather accumulates. Black people are seen as garbage to the United States, something to be discarded, makes environmental degradation inevitable. Public deliberation, public advocacy are just another link. The black body is found in opposition to what it means to be part of civil society. That's a Hartman evidence democracy can't take into consideration the grammar of black suffering. Black bodies are always used for the vote, but never the voice. No demands of blackness can be articulated in the public sphere. Extend the James evidence as it said any politics not far from themselves. The black woman's structural position, racial rape was doomed to miss what's essential about the problem. Civil society maintains itself of the accumulation of black women within the public sphere. I think I explained across pretty clearly how black people not only make up the identity process, do not maintain a part in the identity making process, but make this space for other people in a reduced to dereliction, not only forcefully reproduce and are forcefully reproduced and placed into captivity for civil society to render itself coherent. Environmentalism treats black people as trash through things like gentrification of cities, through the construction of green places and areas of affordable housing previously existed, driving up the cost of living, blaming black people for environmental problems they doesn't consume, expensive designer of organic foods to strive for hybrid electric cars, creating environmental laws that let present people polluting certain chemicals or alternative is about ending the world. Part of the ending the world means ending the current paradigm of overconsumption that drives not only drives a bunch of environmental issues, since black people occupy a space of absolute dereliction. Resolving environmental problems against them requires cleaning up the entire planet. There's still some dark corner of the planet, or else there's still some dark corner of the planet available for black people to be forced into, not to mention whatever. I don't want to talk about that. Your role of the judge in this debate is to endorse and reproduce the alternatives that effective present or unflinching refusal, compromise, and debate literally works to generate and circulate bodies, resist any non-consensual extension, civil society, and institutions, even the alternative produces. You can still vote negative to align yourself with our emotional energy, pessimistic refusal to accept the half-assed measures on a state bent on destruction of black life. Producing this alternative energy prerequisite in successful movements, and the only structural guarantee against co-option must be understood. Our James evidence highlights that it must be understood through linguistic, material, and mental economies, rhetoric, and grammar. The affirmative shapes the way that you should understand their sequencing question. The James evidence says that we have to start from the black matrix, or else we risk overcoding racial capital, racial rape. Even the most pragmatic action within the United States for black people, like ending police brutality, mass incarceration, still glazes over the intimate violence that happens towards black women in the structural position of racial rape. Is not a question of can the act make the world a bit better for black people's question of sequencing and grammars that we use to understand and resist violence. Since that grammar articulates their relationship to the world, all their arguments about present abolition, LOL, black women's bodies make up the ground and space for which we understand norms and criminality. Black skin is marked as criminal. Henceforth, we can define what other people do, mark them, and place them into zones such as prisons. What they're not understanding is captivity means that there was never a consensual relationship to space/time, but black women and the existence of black people in America are the substance the substance that make up the bars for people to be in prison. Their argument about prison abolition assumes at the end of that removing and stopping a prison from being built is in line with the end of the world. Our argument is marking things as an event is exactly what racial neoliberalism has transformed into. We went from slavery, Jim Crow, the prison industrial complex. All of those things change the material vitality of blackness, but do not alter the ontological positions, but render bodies coherent for being at top of the movement. This is why Wilderson writes that prison abolition will likely be similar to slavery abolition, where white people have to stay in control of the movements to render other bodies coherent. It's not coherent because black people are always already making demands. They've conceded that, we've conceded that. Their argument is that that NEPA makes those demands accessible/possible. Our argument is that's exactly the problem. Assumes that we remove a barrier, and once we remove that barrier, voices are heard. Our argument is that is much too naive and not something that we should put a hope into in context, especially in context of the affirmative. Why Okinawa? Why not Flint? People will, even when we know that black people are being shit on daily, we send water to Flint and give them water to survive another day in the world, which our argument is that relationship is already consensual without value. The AF teaches people how to live as a slave. The alternative teaches people how to not be a slave at all. Black skin and black skin is always already marked as criminal. The AF can't remove that criminality marked as skin, which means that the grammar that black people articulate politics through will always already not be your voice because your skin overdetermines voice. Even if people like black people are making demands about the environment, our argument is obviously not dismissal of people who have legitimate claims, but rather says that this is a parasitic place to do it. We should probably end the current political system in which you've indicated is bad and live our cool little maroon life wherever the fuck we want to, where black people don't shit on the environment because we have a heart, morality, and other things that I think the current political system doesn't. Next, I think that I'll start at their argument about sandbagging, about how they put sand in the institutions. I'm not even sure that this argument is cohesive / a good argument. All other environmental issues that have happened throughout the world where the United States goes to another place to clean it up does not change the remedy, does not create space / remedy existing conditions for black people. There's only a risk that people like white women start focusing on things that happen in Okinawa and don't give a shit about what happens to black people in places like Flint, Detroit. The argument that it transforms larger social movements assumes that we should be focused on social movements where white people get to send one bottle of water to Flint, feel good about themselves for leaving the day, or contribute to their GoFundMe. Even all of their arguments assume that movements happen, and once movements happen, things get better. Argument is that movements are existing now. Public deliberation is already flawed. Their argument that it's not a question of the government, but it's a question of allowing for people to voice their arguments is exactly our link to their argument that it's not a question of state violence, good or bad, but the grammar through which we articulate / understand violence. Their argument their argument about this one indigenous person who got land back because they understood that windmills were being put on the land. Our argument is it proves all of our arguments about gentrification / the way that we understand time and space and land. Their argument is it was a win for black people to stop a prison from being built within their communities. Our question is it was never their fucking community to begin with. Black people, it's not black people's land, which is what James evidence indicates when it's a context of eco-melancholia, because the James evidence indicates that black people were always already at a loss within space. So assuming that the prison slash the space is a moment to freedom by gaining that land back denies the other antagonism of the world, which is that we're on stolen land to begin with. All of these things articulate our relationship to the world and make ourselves sound coherent when always already black people exist nowhere to the world, and henceforth are captive. The Gordon evidence as LOL not even in line with the affirmative. This evidence indicates that we have to be revolutionary, but not that we have to be redemptive. The one you see is definitely redemptive because they indicate that politics have a place, that public deliberation can happen, and these are things that the affirmative cannot sever from. Our argument is that we should create new signs and symbols to interpret blackness outside of existing civil society. Their argument about the James evidence being nihilistic is LOL funny. I don't think that's true. James is not James being psychoanalytic. I just don't think that's true. Our argument is it's not some Hegelian, our argument is that there is no other way to articulate the violence that happens within the libidinal economy, not that all violence can be understood as some predisposition to it. Simply put, if it walks like a Miley and talks like a Miley, I'm gonna call it a fucking Miley. Their next argument is the Nopper evidence doesn't link to them. The Nopper evidence does link to them. It's a question of which notion the way that we articulate binaries is particularly important. The way that we contextualize the grammars and analytics that we use for our arguments. The argument that their negative state action does not make sense / matter. Rand Paul is negative state. He's definitely not in line with the alternative. Our argument is that the reason, it's not just enough that you're doing the right thing. Our argument is you're doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, which is not a reason to vote affirmative, because the grammar through which you've articulated and use of articulated violence is parasitic for black people. Simply put, if you don't see anti-blackness instead of racism in the one you see, we have our link.
Good. Mm-hmm. All right. What is social death?
Yeah, so social death is defined through 3 things, first of which being general dishonor, natal alienation, and, well, you have made a discrepancy between the two, but I will define the last one. Well, general dishonor. What did I miss?
Gratuitous violence.
Oh, yeah.
What? Are you agreeing with gratuitous violence, or is there something else?
Yeah, but you made a discrepancy in one of your pieces of evidence, so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't using
that's
your
fine.
terms
I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. I have a question about legal change. Let's talk about hashtag Buy Anita, where black organizers challenged Anita, who was like a Cook County official and covered up police violence. That movement was successful. It got Anita out of office. And
I'm arguing what you define as successful. You've indicated that material things have changed. Our argument is sure, it's great that people can drink at the same water fountain as you. It's great that the Black Girl Mantra exists. Our argument is those things do nothing to alter the structural foundation / structural
Yeah, sure, but
condition
even if
for
it
which
doesn't
we relate
alter
to
the
the world.
structural foundation, why isn't it still a good thing that Anita Alvarez no longer has the capacity to cover up cop killers?
No, I just don't think that's true.
Killers.
Our argument is that racism is much, much more complex than that. So yes, that thing happened, and now we have things to cling to, like what you're telling me now, when at the end of the day, little kids are still shot for holding a toy gun. Or Miley Cyrus still likes to twerk on black women's bodies.
Okay, sure, but explain to me
So the
how...
material thing renders this system coherent.
Yeah, I'm
so
totally
the fact that
with
you're
you
even saying
that
optimistic things like that makes it
I'm
good
totally with you
is our argument.
that doesn't totally resolve everything.
No, but that's not what I'm saying.
What does a paradigmatic analysis do, though?
Right, our argument is that existing within the world is parasitic. I just explained this above where I said that it's not a question of is it good or bad that she can point out things about cop killers. The point is that pushing that optimistic framework back into the situation in which we can provide a material thing for black people to cling to is exactly our argument. That if Buy Anita actually worked as it works in that way, then I would have to put psychic energy back into a government that does a plethora of other fucked up shit.
What does analysis do to actually form material struggles, a material change?
I think that I'm arguing the distinction, and I keep trying to clarify this, the distinction between material and ontological. Our argument is the ontology shapes the material. You've indicated that you can change things like the material foundations. I've argued that those things do not rectify, nor do they even adhere to the material conditions.
Okay, I don't think I'm
material
really getting
conditions,
anywhere with
so
this
like,
kind of
let's
question.
say I make $1 million and I live a really bougie life. Black people are still being shot gratuitously.
You made an argument about maroon communities no longer wanting to pollute. How do maroon communities get around things like air pollution or water contamination that happens in one area but then flows downstream?
Well, when I don't think that
affects
the app
others?
solves that will be large portions of the one
Sure,
in R.
sure,
But
but
I
we're talking
also
about your
think that
alternative.
our argument is that black people are treated as trash, which means that even in a world where material positions are changed and things like the way that you conceptualize waste/space is fundamentally flawed because black people themselves are the trash/waste.
Are there cards in this speech?
Yeah, I just sent it out.
I got it. Thanks.
Can I have the podium?
This is the 8th, 9th 1NR in my documents folder. Entitled 1NR.
Yeah,
They're probably
I'm sorry, I didn't put a number on it.
Oh no, I don't care. I just thought it was a fun fact we all might be interested in. But we weren't.
Alright. Is anybody not flowing straight down? Okay. So, yeah, straight down.
I'm sorry, I was just stopping to contemplate other ways that it could be flowing.
Sideways, diagonally.
Yeah.
I don't know, some people like to jump places.
But
I think one time a person was told
Okay.
to float in a triangle. Anyway.
That's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
Might try
They
to
followed
understand it.
they followed the instructions. Okay. Anyone not ready?
Okay.
The role of the ballot is who best resists anti-black violence. Their framework is terrible because they prove the concept of materiality is flawed because it assumes remedying material conditions is the only way to be political. Now, framing ontology should come first. Action presupposes a particular account of reality that predetermines available solutions. We win. That their diagnosis of violence is wrong. You reject their analysis before you evaluate their method. Brian, in 15. Ontology, general theory of what it means to give an account of something when a psychiatrist prescribed it is presupposing ontology that the cause of anxiety, neurological, chemical imbalance, and variant materialist ontology. Ontology influences practice, also influences research, no escaping ontology, nor is there's no letters that does not make ontological propositions. Critiquing them carries the possibility of improving both inquiry and practice. Now, a big dissad is the absent encouragement for black people to put demands on the government. They emphasize the small successes black people have acquired while ignoring how BLM, Ferguson, and Baltimore also tried to make demands on the government, but were met with violence, which means that even if the AF isn't a forcing of black people to invest in the government, they create a cruel optimism for black people to engage with the state. Even if doing so will almost certainly mean that they will be met with tear gas, arrested on master shot on site. The acts call for greater visibility and fuller representation of people of color, traps them in civil society, producing new techniques of surveillance and domination, only refusing visibility and pessimistically withdrawing into the darkness can provide effective alternatives to civil society. And Youngo in 12. To say that our hearts go out to a mother whose infant children are torn from to say that something in the universe go deaf and blind to the refuse of banishment of sentimentality. I took the stop no heart when out of the man stirred within me to make greater visibility through black pain suffering agency. I was reminded of all the visibility of the darkness that fell in New York during Hurricane Sandy was none other than the absurdity of which black life is unreal illumination can be as deadly as the black knife, nor more was stupid to try into the storm. Her home was safe while her white neighbors were right to fear black leaders, sources, and home invaders. And media exposure brings such enlightenment or we better off in the dark. Such a performance of ostentatious consideration controlled by the reminder of blackness is a clear proof of stupidity. Is still a condition of the world in which Glenn more speechless with both safe and abandoned rather than greater visibility in black condition. The fuller representation of political space is prone to betray us. What we need is greater euchromia. We need to learn from the point of view of blackness what determines color bad. Then what limits is euchromia darkness we have it. Perhaps it is not for us to prepare the violent relatedness manifest in public disbelief that any kind of black person can get, but their disaster could possibly prove credible. Perhaps it is rather left to us to disturb that violent relatedness. Now, even if they win that the state is effective in the it isn't in the context of it, NEPA, the Uma-Alka evidence indicates that the processes of NEPA requires are little more than a facade. In Grandel, public hearings occurred around the development of a hotel and parking garage, but the public participation had little, if any, influence on the development of the project. NEPA only requires public participation after both the environmental assessment and environmental impact statement are completed, at which point the public is unable to exert any influence on actions, which means that their arguments for NEPA being a good nexus for organizing or disprove are tenuous at best, and the immediate attention that NEPA brings is actually dangerous to black people. Hypervisibility is not a good thing, which is why Beyonce and Jay-Z are still met with so much anti-blackness and racial slurs, harassment, etc., and why the women who interrupted the Bernie rally were met with outrage and hate, and why Obama's got more death threats than any other president, and why Daniel Holtzclaw, who raped dozens of black women, was hailed as a pussy slayer, and the black women who were raped were labeled whores, Jezebels, dirt, nothing. The AF is racial managerialism. They frame their politics around addressing global concerns. It should be suspect that rather than listening to Okinawans and basing the removal of the base solely on the protests of the people there, they would have to decide it based on NEPA. It's not, clearly it's not enough to listen to Okinawans. They don't do it in any mainland location, Djibouti, etc. If the topic was a limitation, then why wouldn't they do it in all the topic areas? That is the ultimate racial managerialism, that they would only do it in a certain area disproves the legitimacy of it. Now, the Rodriguez evidence, I don't think I have a specific answer to this. They're focused on international conflicts, allow them to ignore how even their own bodies are implicated within anti-blackness here. You should question their sincerity when you ask why did they start with Okinawa instead of Flint, an event that is a literal waste dumping within the domestic confines of the U.S., but is influenced by anti-blackness and literally implicates the location of their bodies within the space, which is why more white liberals are more comfortable protesting wars elsewhere, which is what the Rodriguez evidence says is why people don't protest domestic warfare. Even if we do not go for the alternative, we have linear dissents of the app that aren't resolved by a combination of the advocacies. Now, they don't get a permutation. We should hold advocacies to standards in which they can be tested as productions of scholarship and whether that scholarship is valuable. They don't get points for being good enough and saying violence bad. Second, enforces black as a compromise and flinch for whiteness. Even if they win that some part of the app is good, the perm eliminates the revolutionary potential of the alt in favor of a kinder, gentler anti-blackness. Third, is the replication of whiteness as a form of co-option and fluidity that enables white people to shift between identities. Is especially true when they throw out two perms without parsing out any distinction between them or how they work perm to both is not an argument. And if we have a link, the app can be a parallel front to the alternative because they are in opposition, and there's no reason why either of the perms void the links, which means they still into the permutation. This debate is about the app's research practices, which means that the political grammar model they've constructed are problematic, and that means you prefer our alternative as an alternative research practice. The role of the negatives to criticize the app's ontology. If we win that ontology comes first, that means the perm fails because it includes bad ontology, or it would be severance, which is a voting issue because it makes the app a moving target and makes it impossible to garner stable links. Now, this debate is not about who best catalyzes movements through policy, but about who presents the best analytic for explaining anti-blackness. If we win that their description of blackness is problematic, then that proceeds the question of policy efficacy and calls into question their ability to solve any of the app. All of their evidence about people of color proves that their analytic is exclusive with one that focuses on blackness as captivity, which leads me to the coalitional politics. Is that they're focused on the white, non-white binary obfuscates to focus on the true antagonism that underlies the world of black, non-black, and binary. That is not for yes, there are other reasons besides black and white, but the point is that one, there's no horizontal equivalent to the position of blackness, and second, those people, regardless of their inaccessibility to whiteness, have the power and privilege to oppress black people. This is clearly a trade-off because all of their analysis compares the experience of black people with other people of color, ignores the specifically exaggerated nature of black experience, i.e. people of color writ large aren't affected by segregation, dumping, etc., on the same level, and those distinctions and levels are important. Second, is futurity rely on reformulation of the U.S. policy makes the perm impossible. That's all of the links from the 2NC.
Alright. We have 944. It's definitely not necessary.
Okay. Okay.
Everybody good? A lack of effective NEPA review allows the government to run over poor communities of color with impunity. It causes systematic lowering of life expectancy, quality of life. The app spills up to challenge larger powerlessness by coalescing communities around environmental justice and empowering change, which challenges systematic governmental racism at its core. Independently, extraterritorial NEPA reviews stop waste dumping globally, which causes millions of deaths. It's external. Prefer it. A. Redress. We will win. A risk that legal changes stop violence domestically, but a lack of extraterritorial NEPA means there are no checks on our impact. B. It's concrete. Cleaning up and preventing waste is an easily identifiable problem. Now NEPA resolves the app. Resolves the app even if the suits themselves are not successful, because it causes a recentering of energy and attention in communities. It radicalizes people. It causes organizing that can be used as a jumping off point against other structures of powerlessness, which means we are a prerequisite to the old, which is the Wilson card to throw sand to the gears of the law, which will be below. Examples include prison closure, Rosebud, Ross, and Bullard. Now, ending prison is not the horizon of politics, but if we win, there is no static monster under the bed of anti-blackness. It means it's the only type of possible change is incremental, so there is no monolithic and ontological anti-blackness. It takes out the role of the ballot argument. The Bryant card is merely a definition of ontology, does not prove anything. Anti-blackness is not a universal ontological condition, but an ongoing political project at the hands of white supremacy that can be changed, which is proven by history. All the conditions of anti-blackness were equally applicable to religious persecution, but their argument is those are no longer antagonisms. Even if they seemed fixed at the time, they were not, and human systems are inherently changeable. They assume we can have prior knowledge to our own existence of fundamental social rules instead of something we learn and recreate. They are not laws of physics inherent to the universe. Empowerment specifically is key because it addresses social conditions that make anti-blackness possible. Initially, it's the important framing. We don't have to win total solvency, but then every struggle, even the ones that they see as failed, build up to larger change. This means you prefer action that can improve material conditions over philosophical registers like social death. It's impossible for humans to have a perfect understanding of our theoretical conditions, but we know there is subjective value in life and the ability to make it better despite pessimist theorizing, which is demonstrated by slave rebellions with material impact, which is all the Gordon card. You know they are in trouble when it took us a minute and a half to read and it was answered in approximately 3 seconds. Now they make an argument about sapping energy. This is non-unique. Our evidence says there are legal challenges using NEPA. Now they failed. The government uses loopholes. There's no trade-off. All arguments about challenging legitimacy of the law demonstrate the possibility of parallel fronts, and immediate needs are important. There are people dying of waste, and those who have dumping in their neighborhoods. They do not require long-term investment of extra legal activism or their policies that solve now. NEPA challenges their only impact, which is social death. A is a result of general dishonorment through empowerment. It also results gratuitous violence because of stopping the type of prison construction their evidence is talking about. A result of natal alienation by as it being a nexus point for bringing communities closer together. They have a great generic description of anti-blackness in the environment. None of it is about NEPA, which empirically works. There is not a coming catastrophe, but instead ongoing dumping, etc., which means we don't fall victim to their linearity link. It is not inherently inevitable because it has empirically been addressed. Now, the alternative fails because it's an infinite process of circulation. Chandler reviewing Dean and 10 left take refusals and the frames the circulation of ideas will control collectivities, martial left retrieval, safe remediation of collective action, radicalism, empirically based on changing the world, then articulation of oppositional identity, not instrumental. Articulation of protest left, articulation providing alternative voices, spaces of forms to think about engagement, mass society, and organized have the left, focusing on giving voices space to reproduce the nomination of community patterns, more than proliferation of message without responsibility development, defend positions, and external accountability, community patterns, help with the individual frameworks, gives the impression of shared discourse, belief reality, with the neoliberal frameworks continuing unopposed. They have not answered the white card. There is an entire political system, the school, the prison, etc., that overwhelms any of their change, which means that only concrete policies where we can point from point A, something is done, point B, something changes, are valuable, unlike the alternative where they have no explanation of how affect overwhelms the entirety of the else, and they've set the standard for solvency incredibly high, i.e. needing to fix everything, so they obviously cannot end consumption. Now, NEPA can only prevent gentrification because it stops building, it does not justify it, which takes out this argument that it's also the card about revolution, the Gordon card is about revolution, it is also about reformist genocide. There is no inside or outside, but instead they are inherently connected. Now, the framework debate, prioritizing the effects of policy is best to harness debate's ability to change the world. It teaches us to implementation, reaction, jurisdiction, and cost. And Islam and Napoli says this allows us to influence larger policies with scholar activism, which is empirically true for environmental justice, where learning about the law can effectually make us use it better. That's Bullard and also the 2AC card. This means A, we get to weigh the F, and B, no solvency, because these things are inevitable. Now, they make an argument about how we treat all people of color as the same, but there are not just black people that are harmed by NEPA. Our evidence proves that toxic dumping has differential effects on Native Americans, poor people, etc., which means it is important to recognize particularities so that we can make changes. They say make a white savior argument. We turn this at 2 levels. First is that status quo NEPA reviews are controlled by military lawyers. The F removes their influence. Second is that white people demanding increased access to NEPA is an instance of weaponizing privilege. It should not always fall to people of color to demand an end to unjust practices. Our evidence is specific to environmental law. As infiltrators movements need insiders to gather information and attack white supremacy from the inside out. White people are ideally suited because of the ways that we have benefited from white supremacy. B is the alt is NIMBY, short-sighted logic that allows us only to address oppression that we ourselves face. Now, the law bad debate is not a yes-no issue. Material movements are possible, which is empirically proven. We turn their arguments A through empowerment because if review is inevitable, the F leads to effectiveness. B is sand in the gears. Activists file hundreds of thousands of NEPA reviews. The government has to spend tons of time and money to respond to each individually, to waste time and resources. There's no link anyway. Now, do you want me to finish the Heiner card?
No.
Nah. Perfect. Do the plan of the alternative on parallel fronts that solves best a number of fronts. Every additional battle increases the chance of success by wasting the time of the government. This means the combination of the AF and a paradigmatic analysis is more likely to solve than the Altar-Wilson card is specific, and there's an external weight net benefit. B is an infiltration argument I explained above, which is Wilson and Ford. You should view the perm as a commensurability advantage to the AF. Part of what makes our policy good is its ability to combine with different strategies to challenge oppression, which means that people doing a paradigmatic analysis can continue at the same time as we screw up the state. It does not attempt to steal or embody the alt because we do not necessarily need to enact it. If the alt can get rid of all faith in governments and institutions now, then obviously it can overwhelm the plan, which means that we do get a perm. The Black Lives Matter stuff is answered, but we are not asking for visibility, but an effective strategy for white people in parallel. The card is about the media post-Sandy, which is definitely means that the alternative is unable to solve media attention and go to the white people involved, or it's already the status quo. Now, group the two arguments about how we have picked a particular NEPA setting. So they do not understand the theory of precedent, which means that action in one area affects all other areas simultaneously. Dugong was a lawsuit that has already occurred, which was about Okinawa, but the entire app is about domestic powerlessness, which means that we resolve this turn. The Ford argument also turns it because it says, wait, though waste is global, we are implicated in these networks, which the alt ignores.
You had 846? Is that right?
Okay. That will be the critique. Okay. Is it on the floor? Yeah. Okay. Don't think I have to win an argument about how the alternatives all the alternatives all the they conceded that it's a question of what grammar slash analytic we use to understand such frame our conceptualizations of violence. Their framework arguments in the one year were terrible. They don't actually explain why their role regarding why we should engage in policy simulation. They rather say that we need to understand modes of violence slash understand clash between arguments. Our argument is that those the way that they conceptualize debate does not begin at the intimate violence that happens to ripple towards black women. Their idea of the political process trades off with everyday understanding of intimate violence that happens towards black women. I don't think that one of your answers the James argument, the James evidence, which is going to be the way that I frame the two in R. They've conceded that violence must be understood through libidinal, linguistic, and material economies of rhetoric and grammar. The affirmative shapes the way you should understand our sequencing question. James says that you have to start from the black matrix, or else we risk overcoding racial capital with racial rape. Even the most pragmatic action, like the United States removing prison abolition system, or things like that, or end of police mortality, glaze over the intimate violence towards black women. The structural position of racial rape is not a question of can the app be good, or make the world a little bit better for black people. It's a question of sequencing of grammars that we use to understand and resist violence, aka you can't understand your place in the revolution slash your ability to massage your white privilege unless it starts from the position of captivity in black women's structural position of racial rape, or else white people end up leaving feeling good about themselves for changing some of the contingent structures within America while not realizing that even if you end a prison abolition system, black women's relationship to the earth is one predicated off of eco-melancholia, a epistemic mourning, an ontological mourning of the earth, not relation to it, but relation outside of the world. Is not a question of can we stop gentrification, can we build better schools, can we live in the world. It's a question how the fuck can we stop being a slave. The 1NC provides the only alternative to create new signs and symbols to interpret blackness. They have conceded that Ukrami evidence is not just a question of media, but it says that hoping for civil society to render coherent the violence that happens towards black people, aka going to certain places trying to get people to listen to your opinions, ignores the fact that black people need the psychic energy to do such. And when black people invest psychic energy, go to Trump rallies and get called nigger monkeys and get kicked and mobbed, all of those things change the way that public deliberation operates, change the way that we understand politics, and mean that the affirmative's idea of changing or reconceptualizing civil society is incredibly problematic. Even if they win, they can change something material. Our argument is all of 1NC cross-sects where I say, yes, you've won, you can change something material, but the material positions do not define the ontological, because black people are defined as trash. The 1NC asks the question of can we clean up spaces with toxic waste. The 1NC asks why are black places slash urban communities seen as toxic places? Why do white people get anxiety when walking into urban areas? Why do white people feel a certain type of way about urban communities? Why do we dump trash in black communities to begin with? Our argument is because black skin is marked as criminal that cannot be rectified or remedied by material conditions. Even if I learn how to live within the world, I'm still a slave to it. Our argument is the 1NC massages their existing structures and massages the way we feel about violence, but does not alter their ability to be political and redemptive for a certain form of politics, even if they say they're anti-state or links are not to the state. But the way that you've conceptualized violence, we don't have to win the app is bad, but that the grammar the 1NC articulates itself through is problematic. They also conceded our arguments about counter-hegemonies, creating institutional transformation in a common sense and a good sense that rely on Gramscian notions of utilizing the trenches of civil society for creating a new state apparatus. Or put another way, their suggestion that we must change the system from the public to be mobilized for equality is exactly what our second piece of Boulderson Advocates to criticize says. We have a couple disses to this. First is this one says all fits all approach to politics, assuming that these political strategies are equally successful with black and whites, ignores the fact that anti-blackness does not just occur when a black subject defies the state, but occur at any time for simply being black in a structural condition, not contingent, which shapes the way that you should understand their arguments about being white people and that being good because they force the government to reconcile with their problems. Our argument is that only creates and recreates whiteness as power,
and blackness as incapacity. Even if you provide material good shit for those things, there's a reason why we don't think the blind side is a good idea. Their arguments about allowing for people to speak for themselves is exactly the problem. Removing a law and assuming that law can change the remedy the structuring foundation of blackness ignores the fact that blackness / criminality is what gives meaning / weight to law, which is the reason why your analysis must be articulated through the grammar of anti-blackness. I'll answer the permutation here.
In the middle.
Okay. Mean doesn't do specific proof that they're going, actually their permutation means you should hold them to a very high threshold for getting it. They literally have to 1 minute changes they have given are good enough to outweigh the risk of violence that black people demands on the government. Literally force black people to faith in the government. It's cruel optimism, the illusion that there's a future, especially when they can see that empowerment is key, necessarily requires convincing black people to reinvest their political energy within advocacies deemed to fail, which is violence against them. The commensurability argument is not how funny or good. Their argument is that they can operate in parallel worlds. Our argument is black people are outside of the world, which means that any analysis does not start at the analytical framework of blackness, is not parallel. It assumes that there's a relationality to the slave. You've conceded that there's no relationality to be articulated towards blackness / the relationship to the world, which means that your description of parallel worlds is one that does not make sense. You should frame this debate through ontology first. It's conceded the Bryan evidence that indicates that any prescription of violence must be first understood through the description of violence implicates all research practices, methodologies, which means if their understanding for the world is problematic, their conclusion about how to solve violence is not a question of what does the alternative do next, but rather we don't know what the world looks like post the alternative, because it's one where blackness is not framed within captivity, but we have articulated that it's not replenishing new signs and symbols within civil society. Even if it's a hard thing to grasp with, that's the potential of the alternative. It's not do we leave debate feeling better about ourselves because we think that we solve FIPA and FIPA is going to allow for people to have movements, and those movements are going to solve. When you conceded that when black people make movements, they're tear gas shot and met with extreme forms of brutality, it's not a question of law bad. There's obviously going to be violence even after the law is articulated, which is what James says.
All right, we have 724.
Wait, let me set this.
7.
would say case K, but I've kind of given up on that whole thing by now. So arguments. Everyone good? The affirmative upends global waste disposal, which causes millions of deaths and destruction of livelihoods that particularly targets communities who are marginalized on a global level. You have conceded that you should view impacts through the degree of solvency. What does it matter if you have a correct analysis of the way the world functions? If you do not have a way of changing either an ontological or a material structure, you should vote out that we make things better for people on a global level through reducing nuclear waste dumping as well as physical dumping. However, we also have internal links to empowerment, which shatters a fundamental pillar of the system of racial apartheid. The U.S. NEPA is a nexus for community organizing, the media attention, as well as its ability to coalesce people and bring them together, where a common objective brings communities together, which the 2NC explained as valuable on their Maroonage argument, which demonstrates that improvements are possible, but through the particular use of NEPA. This is empirically successful because our broad evidence that stop prison construction. No, this does not trade off with things like intimate violence, but it does combat broad violence like imprisonment and racial targeting, which also includes things like intimate violence, like the rapeability and construct in the prison as well as broader society, which we are a challenge to, and demonstrates that all of their two and our arguments are things like Trump supporters or tear gas also demonstrate that material instances do in fact matter on a broader level. Now, you should not leave this place feeling better about yourself. All our entire argument is that you need to weaponize your privilege, recognize the structural racism of U.S. society. However, we must move beyond that recognition to doing something about that. People who are on the brink of dying because of prison construction and waste dumping do not have the luxury of the paradigmatic analysis. You should leave this space knowing that you use the tools in the toolbox to remedy those harms. Now, the ontology debate, we are absolutely crushing them on this. The 2NC to the Gordon card that took me a minute and a half to read with literally 20 seconds, which was woefully insufficient. Anti-blackness is political. The very fact that its genesis was the middle passage shows the material conditions gave rise to seemingly ontological configurations. This also demonstrates that the converse is true and political change is able to reverse that. The 2NR's examples prove that anti-blackness exists, which we agree with. However, they have not explained why something like a Trump protester demonstrates that it is ontological. Rather, the fact that Trump protesters are specific iterations of a gratuitous form of that social death and violence demonstrate that it is in fact political. History proves our coordinate evidence indicts their frame of just being too-centric. But the last 500 years, it ignores the fact that similar conditions of native alienation, gratuitous violence, and social death existed with the Moors. They were related from their people subjected to horrific amounts of violence. However, that is no longer the status of an ontological antagonism, which demonstrates that instead of being something that is merely out there in the area, anti-blackness, like past similar antagonisms, is something that is able to reverse. The premise of their alternative proves this, which I explained above, because the 2NC said creating maroon communities would change, material conditions can change, and now anti-blackness is a political. If we win this, it means two things. One is only the app is able to challenge this, because it gives you the tools to take down the political pillars of anti-black violence. That means that we win, even if they win framework, because we teach political skills or a better conceptual framework of understanding anti-blackness. Two is that their paradigmatic analysis fails because the misdiagnosis anti-blackness can never get around to solving it. You should not read into their evidence very much because they are not doing a very good job of explaining it. You should not do that work for them. Now, the permutation filters how you view all of their linked arguments. They have grossly mishandled it. It is not a generic perm do both, but it's perm do the app as a paradigmatic analysis and embracement of maroon communities, a parallel front. If the alternative is able to solve and create empowerment for black communities, that overwhelms the majority of their links, because the permutation does not require them to invest a hope in the law, but rather it has us engaged in the law, them engaged in other strategies. It's a parallel front to that. There are multiple net benefits. First is that it overstretches the state. Pure gassing is happening in the status quo, especially because NEPA reviews are already occurring. However, having a legal front which drains a bunch of resources causes cops to get called into court to waste their time, money, and energy is something that materially decreases that. It makes non-reformist strategies net more effective. That is our Wilson evidence from the 1ACB, is that having an insider is good. This also answers their framework arguments and proves that learning about the government is valuable, allows for white people to weaponize their privilege by using, by learning what is happening in the state so they can get a word to outside fronts and make those net more effective. This means that even if we disagree on the theoretical foundation of the world, we can still work towards the same end as parallel and distinct strategies. Seriously, they have messed this up. The framework debate. You should not leave debate with debate as just a source of theoretical quibbles. Rather, it should be oriented around searching for policy consequence. Ars Lama and the holy evidence is fantastic that the window is open for policy scholars to have material impact on policy, and that only by learning about how to research implementational, jurisdictional, class concerns that speak to the concerns of policymakers can debate be used as a site of weaponizing to ban large-scale problems like NDT. You should filter any deficiencies for framework through the utter lack of alternative explanation. The 2NR, what exactly do they do? How do they form a counter-institutional white evidence in the case of micro-political strategies like creating a new vocabulary of resistance do not resolve the broader terrain of macro politics or get infinitely bogged down. The Chandler and Dean evidence is the infinite search for a new theory, etc. is just a recirculation of ideals that have been circulated before and do not have anything material to prove for it, which shows that our framework that forces you to expand your horizon beyond mere theoretical quibbles to actually change the world is the only way to actually do that. Now, the rest of the arguments about discourse being treated unequally is obviously something we agree with. The entire 1AC is not a race-neutral characterization of the environment they cast us as, but rather a recognition that NEPA reviews are controlled by white military and corporate lawyers in the status quo, and that by demanding the communities have a voice that's able to challenge that, the empirical success blocking prisons demonstrates that even voices viewed as less credible will do something. Guess me.
It's not that ending prisons is the end point of the goal, but instead...
Obviously, ending prisons is not the end point of the goal. The entire point of NEPA is using Okinawa as a stepping stone for broader challenge to the tool in the toolbox, and having an effective NEPA mechanism allows for different communities to determine what is their best needs. That is all the app is about. I'm sick.
Oh.
Air handshake?
Oh, maybe. Oh.